All right, so you need to cut a 4x4. Seems like a pretty straightforward task, right? Something every DIYer tackles at some point.
But it's actually way more nuanced than you might think.
Really. Because I have to admit, I've stood in the lumber aisle at the hardware store staring at those 4x4s.
Yeah.
Like, okay, now what?
You and everyone else. This deep dive is all about breaking down the different ways to wrangle those posts, because honestly, the how can make or break your entire project.
Okay, so before we even get into the tools themselves, what's the big deal with 4x4s anyway? They seem kind of basic.
That's where the deception lies. First off, a 4x4 isn't actually 4 inches by 4 inches. It's actually 3.5 by 3.5.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, it throws people off all the time. Plus, we're often talking about pressure-treated lumber, which means it's tougher to cut through.
So it's not like slicing through a pine board for a birdhouse. This is the real deal.
Exactly. And when we're talking decks, fences, those kinds of projects, you need accuracy. It's not just about brute force. It's about getting those cuts level and square so everything lines up perfectly.
Which I imagine is way harder than it sounds when you're dealing with a giant, heavy post. So let's talk tools. When you're picturing cutting a 4x4, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For me, it's always the table saw.
The trusty table saw. It's definitely a go-to for a lot of cuts, but when it comes to 4x4s, well, imagine trying to slice a baguette with a deli slicer.
Interesting analogy. So you're saying it's doable, but not ideal.
Exactly. A 10-inch table saw can technically cut through a 4x4, but those things are long and heavy. Even with an extra set of hands, it can be tricky and dangerous to maneuver that much lumber on a table saw.
Yeah, I can see how that could get sketchy fast.
Yeah.
What about the tool that seemed to have an answer for everything, the chainsaw?
Chainsaw, now, you're talking serious power. And don't get me wrong, they have their place. But precision? Not so much.
So maybe not the best choice for those intricate cuts on our hypothetical deck project.
You might end up with something that looks more like a beaver took a bite out of it than a clean cut. For rough work, sure, a chainsaw can get the job done. But when accuracy matters, it's best to leave the chainsaw in the shed.
All right, so let's bring it down to a more manageable level. What about the good old-fashioned handsaw? I feel like that's how they've been cutting wood for centuries.
You're right, it's a classic for a reason, and you'd be surprised, sometimes the simplest tools are the best. The article mentions that it might be slower, more labor-intensive, but
Yeah, I was going to say my arm would be toast after cutting through one of those posts.
you'd get a workout, that's for sure. But that slower pace forces you to be more deliberate, more precise. It's all about control.
Okay, that makes sense. So the handsaw could be a contender for smaller cuts where accuracy is key.
Exactly. Plus, no loud motors to worry about.
Always a bonus. All right, now onto a tool most DIY enthusiasts probably have in their arsenal, the circular saw. Now we're talking power and versatility.
For sure, circular saws are great, but there's a catch with 4x4s. Most circular saws can't cut all the way through in one go. The blade just isn't deep enough.
So how do you avoid ending up with a half-cut post and a whole lot of frustration?
Well, you've got to get a little creative. The article suggests a two-step process measure and mark the cut on two sides of the post, then flip it to complete the cut.
Okay, but I'm already picturing myself messing that up. 2 cuts with a circular saw? That just seems like a recipe for a wonky post.
And that's the danger. You absolutely need to be precise with your markings and make sure those cuts line up perfectly.
So what's the secret? How do you ensure those 2 cuts meet up without turning your 4x4 into a parallelogram
Honestly, this is where a speed square becomes your best friend.
to keep those angles nice and square?
You got it. And don't even think about freehanding it. Clamps are essential to keep that 4x4 from moving while you're making the cut.
Safety and precision, got it. Speaking of precision, the article also mentioned 12-inch miter saws. And I have to admit, that's where my DIY knowledge starts to get a little fuzzy.
I hear you. We're moving into the realm of tools that make you feel like a pro.
So for those of us who might be more familiar with a basic miter saw, what makes a 12-inch version so special?
Those extra 2 inches of blade might not seem like much, but they make a world of difference when you're dealing with thick lumber like a 4x4. We're talking one clean cut, no need to flip the post.
Efficiency. I like it. But before we get too far, can we back up a bit? For those of us who are new to this, what exactly is a miter cut, and why is that important when we're talking 4x4s?
Great question. A miter cut is basically an angled cut as opposed to a straight 90-degree cut. It's what you use when you're joining 2 pieces of wood at an angle, like the corner of a picture frame or...
Corners of our hypothetical deck.
You got it. Miter cuts give you those nice, tight joints that make a project look polished, and with a 12-inch miter saw, you can cut through a 4x4 in one shot.
Okay, that makes sense. So a 12-inch miter saw sounds like a dream for those more intricate cuts. But what about those of us who might have a 10-inch version at home? Are we out of luck?
Not at all. You can still work with a 10-inch miter saw, it just takes a bit more finesse. The article mentions making an initial cut as deep as you can go, then flipping the post 180 degrees and making a second cut.
Flipping that heavy 4x4. I'm already feeling nervous.
Yeah.
What's the trick to making sure those two cuts line up perfectly when you're flipping it?
Honestly, practice. It really does make perfect. Precision is key here, making sure you're flipping the post exactly 180 degrees. Maybe try it out on a scrap piece of wood first. Get the hang of it before you go for the real deal.
Great advice. Especially because, as you mentioned earlier, we're often dealing with pressure-treated lumber, which is a whole other beast.
Exactly. And that brings us to the last two saws on our list, the radial arm saw and the slide compound miter saw.
Okay, now we're getting to the big leagues. These sound like tools even I'd be a little intimidated by.
They're definitely a step up. Both offer amazing power and precision, especially for larger cuts. But,
There's always a but.
well, they do come with a heftier price tag, and they often require more space.
So maybe not your everyday grab-and-go sauce.
Probably not for your average DIYer, although if you've got the space and the budget, they can definitely up your woodworking game. But for most projects, the other saws we discussed will do the trick. Speaking of tools that are great for certain jobs, but maybe not ideal for precision 4x4 cutting, the reciprocating saw.
Ah, yes, the reciprocating saw. I feel like that's the tool you reach for when you just need to get something done, no matter what.
It's definitely got a bit of a demolition derby vibe. You know, rough cuts, fast cuts.
Not exactly known for its finesse.
Exactly. It's like using a sledgehammer to hang a picture frame. It might work, but...
There's probably a better tool for the job.
Yeah.
So we've talked about a lot of different saws, each with its own personality and quirks. I have to say, I'm looking at my own toolbox a little differently now.
I'm glad to hear it, because understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each tool is half the battle. It's like having different paintbrushes for different effects. You wouldn't use a fine-tipped brush to paint a wall, right?
Right. So for our listeners who are feeling inspired to tackle their next outdoor project involving 4x4s, how do they choose the right tool for the job? I mean, where do you even begin?
Well, it all comes down to a few key factors. Well, you've got to think about the level of precision you need for the project. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Okay, so precision first. How do you determine just how precise a cut needs to be? It's wood, it's a saw. Seems pretty straightforward.
It all goes back to the function of that 4x4. Think about it, a fence post that's going to be partially burred. You've got some wiggle room there. But a support beam for a deck that's going to be holding up, your family and friends, precision is non-negotiable.
So safety first. That makes sense. What about the tools themselves? We covered everything from basic hand saws to those professional-grade miter saws. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all the options.
It really is. And honestly, it's easy to get caught up in the I need every tool in the book mentality, but you've got to be realistic about what you had access to and, importantly, what you feel comfortable using.
Yeah, I'm all for trying new things, but maybe not when it comes to a powerful saw and a giant piece of lumber.
Exactly. If you're just starting out, maybe borrowing a tool or renting something is a good way to dip your toes in the water before, going all in on a tool you might only use once.
And speaking of dipping your toes in the water safety, I imagine that plays a big role in choosing the right tool, too.
Absolutely. And skill level. You don't want to hand someone who's never picked up a saw before, a chainsaw, and say, have at it. Start with something you feel comfortable with, even if it takes a little longer. There's no shame in going slow and steady, especially with power tools.
Slow and steady wins the race. And maybe have a first aid kit handy, just in case.
Always a good idea. And honestly, one of the best pieces of advice I can give you is, even if you're feeling confident, practice on a scrap piece of wood first.
Oh, that's such a good point. It's tempting to just jump right into the project, but getting a feel for how the saw handles, how the wood reacts.
Exactly. Pressure-treated lumber can behave differently than other types of wood, so it's always good to get a feel for it before you're aiming for those perfect cuts on your actual project.
This deep dive has been eye-opening. Who knew there was so much to consider when it comes to something as seemingly simple as cutting a 4x4?
Right. It seems so basic. But like with so many DIY projects, the difference between a successful project and a bit of a woodworking disaster often comes down to the details. Choosing the right tool and understanding those little nuances can make all the difference.
Well said. So as you're planning your next outdoor building project, remember, think about those 4x4s a little differently. Don't underestimate the importance of the right tool for the job. And most importantly, take your time, be safe, and have fun with it. Until next time, happy building.